Hello, everybody. This is Peter Fox-Penner. I'm the director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy at Boston University. Thank you all for joining us today for what promises to be a very, very interesting discussion on transmission and renewables. We're really pleased that you would spend some of your day with us. We have a very interesting presentation, and then we want to leave plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So let me just, with no further ado, introduce the panelists and discussants, and then we'll go straight to the presentation and then Q&A. So in no particular order, Kai Van Horn is an expert in leveraging electricity systems modeling, analysis, and visualization to illuminate the impacts of the energy transition. Sorry about the dog there, that's Jake. As a principal analyst of US market fundamentals at National Grid USA, Kai is exploring pathways to deep decarbonization and the associated challenges and opportunities. Pablo Ruiz is one of our colleagues at Boston University, research associate professor in mechanical engineering, but he wears several hats. He's also CEO and CTO of New Grid, a transmission optimization software startup spun off out of ARPA-E, and he's also a senior consultant at Brattle Group. My longtime colleague, Hannes Pfeifenberger, officially Johannes, but we all call him Hannes, is senior fellow at the Institute, our newest senior fellow, and we're proud to welcome him to the ISE. He focuses on transmission's role in decarbonizing, no surprises there. He's also a principal at the Brattle Group, longtime principal, one of the leading transmission economists in the country. Everyone knows that. He's in the energy and the firm's energy practice, and he's also a visiting scholar at MIT. And finally, we're really, really pleased to have a longtime colleague and old friend of ours, Rob Gramlich, who agreed to serve as discussant. Rob Gramlich is founder and president of Grid Strategies, LLC, where he provides economic policy analysis and advice for clients on electric transmission and power markets. He's executive director of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, executive director of the Watt Coalition, on the board of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, advisory council of the Energy Systems Integration Group, and many other advisory boards. And forgive me, Rob, I'm not going to read them all. It's an incredibly distinguished group. We're honored to have you. So without further ado, I will turn it over to, I think, Kai, who will show us some slides. And put your question, by the way, Q&A in the chat or Q&A box in this webinar format, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Thank you. And over to you, Kai.
Thank you, Peter. So as we get started here, I'm going to have Hannes introduce the report and provide some context, and then I'll take it from there to talk about some of the detailed results and how we set up the study and some of the key findings. So let me then pass it off to Hannes to give us some background.
Thank you, Kai. It's really good being here. Thanks for BU and the ISE for making this possible and publishing our paper. This webinar is based on the paper that was published last week or a little bit before then on the value of diversifying uncertain renewables through a transmission system. You have the link to the paper here. We do want to acknowledge the input from many industry participants as listed here, but let's go into the substance of things. Next slide, please. I'll just give you a little bit of context. Kai will then show you the benefits and the study, our takeaways. We won't bother you here with the appendices that are attached to these slides, but as you get the slides after the webinar, you will have some more background on transmission benefit cost analysis and the simulation model that we use to do this case study. Next slide, please. So as we all know, the energy industry is really transitioning to an increasingly clean energy system. While not much is happening at the federal level, the states are really taking the lead, and more than 20 states have mandates or goals to get the majority of their electricity through renewable resources by no later than 2050, and in some cases, even most of it by 2030. Obviously, with renewables, we already have a lot of hydro. The additional development of hydro is limited, so we're talking a lot about wind and solar. And already onshore wind and solar have been the largest sources of new generating capacity in recent years, outperforming conventional generation additions by quite some margin. And now we even have about 30 gigawatts of offshore wind that will get built based on existing commitments by 2035. And a lot of those wind projects, thousands of megawatts, will get to the East Coast, as you see in this little map here, from Virginia to Massachusetts over the next decade or so. Now, transmission is going to play a critical role in making this all possible. Not only do we have to interconnect renewables to the generation load centers, which of course now the most recent challenge is how do we integrate offshore wind? How do we get 9,000 megawatt of offshore wind commitments in New York, for example, into the New York power grid? That itself is a challenge. But we also need to modify the existing grid to adapt to the generation pattern that's changing quite rapidly. And as it turns out, renewables are very weather dependent. So the question is, why do we need transmission? And I think transmission is increasingly more valuable because it connects renewables across or beyond the size of typical weather patterns. If most of New England is in a snowstorm for days, you really need to be connected to the surrounding areas to make it all work. Next slide, please. So when we talk about weather, we talk about correlations of renewable outputs. Obviously, we know what the pattern of solar power looks like. There's a lot more solar power production in the summer than in the winter. Nothing during the night, obviously. But there's a seasonal pattern, there's a daily pattern. Some of that is very predictable. But as we look across geographies, we also know that there's a much diversity. Even if you look at a place like Texas, for example, Western Texas solar is much more valuable than Eastern Texas solar because the sun sets in Western Texas about an hour after it sets in the Eastern load centers, which really makes that solar profile more valuable. But as we look just on a day-to-day basis, we know that cloud cover solar production can change rapidly with cloud cover, and wind variability is also quite variable, quite uncertain. But the correlation of that variability and uncertainty really declines as you go across longer distances. So diversifying uncertain wind profiles over long geographic or distant geographic regions is really valuable because it creates more predictability of total generation. It makes it more easy to balance on the power system. And the key here is, and that's where we focused our case study on, is that there is both predictable variability and uncertainty around those predictions. And it turns out the uncertainty of how well you can forecast renewable output, even on a day-ahead basis, is a very big driver of transmission-related benefits and the cost of integrating renewables. The chart on the right that you see here is our case study. We have real-world data for different wind regimes in Texas that are about 300 miles apart. And you can see there that for a representative day, one zone might see a spike in wind output in the late afternoon, whereas the other zone had its wind output highest during the night. And as you combine those two regions with transmission, you get a smoother, more predictable profile that's easier to balance on the power grid. Next slide, please. So what we are finding is transmission has many benefits, and Appendix A of the slides get into all the benefits that we already know how to quantify. With this case study, we try to quantify a benefit that has not typically been quantified, but turns out to be very significant. Some of what we're talking about is quantifiable with the models that the industry is using, which are based on perfect foresight of hourly generation patterns. But if you have two grids with between 10 and 60% renewable generation, diversifying these renewables by interconnecting these areas through the transmission system can reduce total costs by anywhere between 3 and 23%. And they can reduce renewables curtailments by 45 to 90%, which is very significant. What we have found in this case study, however, is that capturing the uncertainty that exists even on a day-ahead basis is just as important, because the benefit of a system with uncertainty, or the benefit of transmission, of interconnecting regions with uncertain wind profiles, are about 2 to 20 times higher than the benefits of interconnecting the regions if you had perfect foresight. So that's really where our contribution comes in, that we are able to measure and quantify a very important and very sizable part of the transmission-related benefits, which really have to be considered if you want to plan an optimal mix of generation and transmission investments. And those benefits are really coming from greater resource flexibility of the combined power markets, lower renewables variability because of the diversification, lower renewables curtailment because of it, lower variability and better predictability makes it easier to regulate the system. That reduces production cost, but it also increases reliability. Next slide, please. So what are the implications here? Well, the implications are that this is a very important benefit to quantify if you want to plan for economic public policy or so-called multi-value transmission projects. The industry knows how to plan for reliability requirements really well, but on the economic side, the industry is still in the infancy of planning models, where most of the economic planning models do not capture a large portion of the available transmission-related benefits. And our contribution is a new tool, a new way to quantify some of these benefits beyond the benefits we could quantify, but not always do, as you will see in Appendix A. There's also a very important implication on market design in the difference between the benefits that you can capture on a day-ahead basis versus the benefits that additionally accrue in real time. And as it turns out, while renewable shares are sort of in the less than 30% range, most of the diversification benefit, the hourly diversification benefits, you can capture through a real-time energy imbalance market. But as renewable generation share grows, the real-time market is not sufficiently flexible, and you have to add a day-ahead market, day-ahead optimization to capture those benefits that you won't get from the less flexible real-time market. And with that, I will turn it over to Kai to show you what we've actually done and what those results look like.
Great, thanks, Hannes. Thanks for taking us through that context. Also, thanks to the ISC for supporting the work and hosting the webinar. And thank you to all the participants for making time to attend today. So I'm going to talk a bit now about the details of how we set up this study and some of the key findings. So first, starting in on what we intended to do. So our goals for the study were twofold. The first was, as Hannes mentioned, was to isolate the benefits of interconnecting diverse renewable resources for transmission. So to focus in on this category of benefit that sort of we kind of all knew was there, but we never had really put a number to it to say like how big is that? Is it significant? And the second piece was to explore how those benefits and benefits more generally are impacted by including uncertainty in the type of analysis you do to quantify these benefits. And this is increasingly important, as Hannes mentioned, as we push toward systems with high levels of renewables, and uncertainty becomes a bigger driver of operational outcomes. And so our approach to doing this was to construct two identical systems that are the same in every way, except for the renewable profile. So in these cases, we have two different wind profiles in ERCOT, one in zone A and one in zone B. Those are the only difference between the systems. And then we simulate that separate systems model, and then we simulate them with a transmission in between as a combined or interconnected systems model, and compare across a variety of metrics the impacts of that connection. As we construct these models, we also included forecast uncertainty and multiple decision-making timeframes, which I'll talk about. But that also allowed us to tease out this impact of uncertainty. So a few more details on the model. So we wanted this to be, we wanted to use a realistic system to do this study. So we sort of modeled it after an SPP like generation mix, and we use an SPP load profile. So we have two systems that are bit scaled down. So there's a 14 gigawatt peak in either case, actual wind generation between two areas for which we could get both forecast and actual wind data that are approximate to SPP. And then we set this up with renewable penetration levels measured as a percentage of annual energy consumption between 10 and 60%. So basically scaling up the actual, the wind in each zone such that the energy that it produces in a year is the appropriate percentage relative to the load. The key thing, though, is that we model 3 decision-making timeframes, and this is something that differentiates our study from others. The first is a day-ahead timeframe, which is the day-ahead forecasts of wind and load, and then we optimize that so we get schedules for the resources in order to meet those loads and wind. Then we also run an hour-ahead scheduling process after that it takes as input. And that has updated forecasts and calculates a new dispatch. And then finally, we have real-time where we have the actual output of wind and load, and we see how the system responds to meeting the changes between the forecast and day-ahead and hour-ahead and meeting real-time load, and steps through that. We also modify what commitment decisions can be made at each stage, so more available resources in day-ahead versus real-time. And this, for our generation mix, use generalized characteristics that are compatible with the different technologies that are represented in the system. But generally, it's a coal-heavy system with a fair amount of gas generation. All of this was done with analytics and Power System Optimizer, which is the optimization framework we've used for a lot of similar type studies because of its benefits for doing this sort of multiple decision-making time frame type simulation. Very flexible for doing that, also very flexible for representing ancillary services. So to go through the results, I'm going to talk about the main benefit metrics that Hannes mentioned, which are production costs and wind curtailment reductions. I'll also talk a bit about regulation reductions and regulation needs, and increased flexibility as a driver of all the benefits. And then reliability, as Hannes mentioned, is a piece of this, but we haven't directly quantified it. So we'll just kind of like hold that in the back of our mind. So now I'm just going to jump right into the meat. So this chart I'm showing on this slide is really like the main benefits chart. How much savings in operating costs for the system accrues as a result of interconnecting the two systems. So what you're seeing on the left-hand axis, the blue axis, is the production cost savings in millions of dollars per year of interconnecting the two systems with an unrestricted amount of transfer capability. And on the right-hand axis, we're seeing that same savings expressed as a percentage of the total cost in the separate systems case. So as you can see, the reduction is substantial. It's on the order of $400 million as we push towards 60% wind penetration. And that amounts to around 23% reduction in total production costs. The main driver of this, there's two primary drivers of this. One is dispatch efficiency, just the ability to draw from a more efficient set of resources when you have an interconnection and a broader group of generation. The other is increased flexibility, which can reduce the amount of curtailment you have. Here we show the curtailment as a driver. This also indicates the kind of a breakdown between those two drivers. First, that additional here we see the total curtailment as a percentage of the potential wind generation in each of the cases. In the sum of separate systems, that's the blue bars, the dark blue bars, and then in the light blue bars, that's the interconnected systems. So you can see at 10%, we had no curtailment. So in that case, we can see that the interconnection benefits are primarily being driven by dispatch efficiency, just using lower cost units. However, as we push towards higher wind penetrations, pushing into the 40, 50, and 60% range, we see that curtailment reductions are substantial, pushing up to 45% in the 60% case. And thus we can conclude that a large portion of the dispatch or the production cost reduction benefits accrue because of the additional flexibility and the reduction in curtailment and the subsequent displacement of thermal generation. Another benefit that we haven't quantified here, but that would be very important in the context of meeting renewables policies, is that reducing curtailment also can reduce the amount of renewable capacity you need to build in order to meet policy targets, which can have an investment cost benefit. One of the drivers of this curtailment reduction is additional available flexibility, which is in part driven by regulation requirement reductions. So as we interconnect the systems, as Hannes mentioned, we have a decline in aggregate variability from renewable generation. That subsequently reduces the regulation needs of the system. So here on the left, we're showing the regulation needs before interconnecting and the regulation needs after interconnecting the systems on the right. And so you can take a close look at this maybe on your own, but the main point is that there's around a 30% reduction when you get to high renewables penetrations in the amount of regulation required. And so that releases capacity that can be used to provide flexibility to absorb more renewable generation. Another benefit that we see is the reduction in CO2 emissions. In all of our cases, we're adding wind to the system. We're looking at a system that has a fixed portfolio of thermal resources, and we're adding wind to that. So we see reductions in CO2 emissions in all cases. The question for the interconnection is really, does it increase the amount, or does it decrease emissions further beyond what you would get if you just had the separate systems? And the answer to that question is that at higher penetrations of wind, the answer that yes, it does. And the primary driver of that is that when we have higher penetrations of wind, this interconnections benefits are driven by curtailment reduction. And so that getting rid of curtailment then allows us to subsequently accrue these CO2 emissions reductions benefits. So up to now, what I've talked you through are the benefits of the system, assuming there's no restriction on flow between the two systems. But obviously in a realistic system, we're going to have to choose how much transmission we want to build between the systems or how much we want to reinforce existing transmission. So we also ran some sensitivities to understand, okay, how do those benefits change if you don't have unrestricted flow? So to do that, we designed 3 additional sensitivity scenarios around the 30% renewables penetration case, where we set limits on how much could be transferred between the systems at 3 levels. The 50th percentile of the flow that we saw in that unconstrained case, the 70th percentile, and at the 90th percentile of that flow. Then we did the same simulations, except now instead of being unrestricted, there is a limit on the flow between the 2 systems. The main question we're trying to ask is, how much of those benefits can we still capture, even if we can't transfer as much as we'd like? And the answer to that question is that most of the benefits can still be captured. What we find is that the vast majority of those benefits are captured even when you get to the 50th or 70th percentile. So in this case, the 30% renewable penetration case, we have 2 markets that are 14,000 megawatt peak loads. Each market has around 6.5 gigawatts of wind, and we can capture the interconnection benefits with an interconnector of around 1,200 megawatts. And that captures the lion's share of the benefits. Similarly, it captures the lion's share of the curtailment reductions. So now we're really excited about kind of like all of the results that I've run through, that the benefits are quite large or are appreciable, this geographic diversity benefit. Also that it's fairly robust to the limits on the flow between the 2 systems. But we're really excited about this other component of the study, the uncertainty component. So we know that forecast uncertainty is a major driver of dispatch and production costs. Real world system operations are complicated and uncertain, and relying on multiple decision-making timeframes to best position the systems in advance of the actual delivery of energy from generation to loads. Typically the system starts off with a schedule or a forecast of system conditions and schedules resources to meet that. Here we're showing a 4-day representative operations chart. The light lines are those day-ahead schedules, say, where you have each hour a specific level for each resource and the forecasts of wind and load. Then we are showing on top of that these dark lines, which are actual outcomes, real-time operations or real-time values for load and wind, and the unit's responses. So in a typical planning study, we would take a perfect foresight type approach, do an hourly simulation that would focus on only one of these views. Maybe it might be the real-time view, but often it's the day-ahead view because we're considering that we have access to every resource for the purposes of commitment. So that's where we start as well. We start with a day-ahead cycle, a decision-making time frame, where we optimize against forecasts and do commitment decisions for all the resources. However, we take it beyond that, and then we additionally simulate, taking those decisions that we made, and then looking at if we have updated forecasts and we need to make more decisions about how we're going to redispatch the system to meet actual demand and actual wind output. What does it look like then? And so our contribution, as Hannes mentioned, is like capturing this uncertainty and capturing the magnitude of the impact of the uncertainty on benefits that we measure. So to put it plainly, the magnitude of those benefits, the magnitude of that impact is substantial. So I'm showing here the same chart that I showed earlier for production cost savings, except that now there's a differentiation between the benefits that we would measure in that total amount of benefits. All the prior charts we were showing were the benefits at the end of the scheduling in real time. Now we're differentiating those benefits that we would accrue if we looked just at the day ahead step and didn't go any further, versus the benefits that we get if we go all the way. So in this case, the dark blue portion of the bar is the day-ahead perfect foresight savings. So the savings that you would measure in a typical planning study using this same system. So in that case, there's almost no benefit until you get to around 30% wind penetration. The hashed part of the bar is the additional savings that we capture because we go beyond day-ahead perfect foresight and also simulate uncertainty going into real time. And so you can see that in all cases, this is more than doubling the measured benefits of interconnecting the two systems. And in fact, it's 10 times higher at the 20% penetration and 3 times higher at the 50% penetration. And so what this means is that that these higher that typical planning studies may undervalue the benefits of transmission using the perfect foresight approach, and that makes it more challenging to consider the trade-offs between local renewables and building transmission to access renewables in other regions, such that we can cost-effectively meet policy goals. For renewables curtailment, we can likewise see that this is the case. We see that more than 50% of the renewable curtailment is occurring because of the inability to accommodate the uncertainty. And that the benefits of reducing that curtailment, are under-captured if we don't capture uncertainty. And this is also broadly consistent with other studies that find that, if you are just simulating hourly day-ahead outcomes, it's generally pretty challenging to replicate the types of curtailment results we see in actual markets. Whereas if we capture uncertainty, then we get a bit closer. Another portion of this that I think is important that Hannes mentioned is that, we can see that as we move from to higher levels of renewable penetration, that the amount of benefits that do accrue in the day ahead tend to increase as a fraction of the total benefits, which gets to the point about the relative value of day ahead integrated markets for integrating renewables. When you have high penetrations of renewables, it's beneficial to be able to commit your resources around those renewables from a broader footprint perspective. Now I want to just start wrapping up so that we have enough time, or plenty of time, for our discussant and for questions and answers. So just to close, the main points are the benefits of geographically diversifying renewables via the transmission system are significant. The magnitude is significant relative to the total production cost in the system, and that the benefits and transmission benefits generally are understated using current study approaches that focus on perfect foresight conditions. So the last point is really that underestimated transmission benefits lead to underinvestment in transmission, which could lead to higher overall costs to meet policy as we pursue the achievement of our net zero ambitions. So with that, I'll leave it and pass it over to our discussant.
Kai, if I could just jump in. First of all, thank you, all of you presenters, for that. I hope you're ready, Rob. And Rob, obviously, we want all your thoughts on this study, but let me just ask you to include in your thoughts a high-level framing around this question. You see lots and lots of work in this area. What about this study and the takeaways from this study is new and important for our audience members to absorb? There are many, many transmission studies, and there's lots of deep decarbonization, carbon pathways, carbon policy studies that are big picture that we're all exposed to these days. What's important emerging from this work? And with that, Rob, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Peter, Hannes, Pablo, and Kai. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've been a big fan of all your work. This paper is one more example of really good cutting edge work that you all have been involved with. So to give you the short, quick answer up front, Peter, I think it quantifies an important factor for the valuation of transmission that as yet had not been quantified, to my knowledge, by anybody. And zooming the lens out a little more broadly, why is that important? I think we are at a crossroads here on determination of benefits of transmission. I think it's been, for example, 10 years since FERC orders Order 1000, the signature planning rule. I think we've seen things that have worked and not worked. I think we are at an emerging consensus around the need to decarbonize and the role of transmission in a clean energy grid, and then in turn the importance of a clean energy grid in powering transportation and buildings. So all of the dynamics, I think, point to a renaissance in transmission planning and how to do that. We've done some transmission expansion over the last decade and a half with MISO multi-value projects and ERCOT competitive renewable energy zones. But interestingly, those lines are pretty much filled up already. And then on the converse, there's at the same time, there are a lot of consumer interests who are frustrated with their expanding transmission charges. And so there are certain other types of transmission that utilities are building that I think a lot of consumers are concerned about. And so they too want better benefits assessment. So whether you're looking at it from more of a pro-transmission or anti-transmission perspective, I think everybody can agree that we should be evaluating the benefits more carefully. And this is especially important because I think most utilities and most RTOs and regulators are now realizing that we're going to be looking at a high renewable energy future. And as this work and other work by Hannes and others have demonstrated, there's sort of three separate properties of renewables that need to be taken separately. One is that they're remote, and arguably most planners aren't even kind of looking at how there's these huge resource areas that are completely disconnected. So that's almost an obvious one. You can just draw a line on a map to try to connect the remote resources. The other is the variability, and there's great value just that there's geographic variation. So you can get a lot more renewable energy by integrating than you could at one given spot. And then this third is the uncertainty, and that's the one that, again, has not really been valued, and that's what this paper does. So I think planners are capable of doing this. These concepts are familiar. I was noted in your book, Peter, the chapter on why we grid, going all the way back to Sam Insel and the original creation of networks as opposed to power plants in basements was because of, load diversity and this, idea that there's, with statistical aggregation, you get a steadier supply. And you can balance load variability. So this variability concept on the supply and demand side is not unfamiliar. We just need to, again, be careful about how we quantify it. Of course, obviously the headline results, these numbers are big. 13% production cost savings at 60% penetration for the the regional variation property, and then 2 to 20x times that amount. Taking the uncertainty into account, that's a very big number. Of course, I should always mention that wind and solar forecasting gets better and better year to year, and that can help to some extent. But I'm told by experts that this methodology used here is good, and there's going to be, it's sort of like a Donald Rumsfeld type. There are known unknowns. We know there are going to be uncertainties, and so we can quantify that. So again, zooming out more broadly, I really hope this list of benefits that are still on the screen here start getting incorporated by regional transmission planners. that this additional benefit based on the uncertainty gets incorporated. I can certainly imagine the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission taking up as a priority transmission planning reform, and so again, it's a very good time to look at the benefits and how to quantify them and what planners should be doing and what all we can recommend, what we all can recommend to those planners and to FERC and state regulators and others involved in that, and the Department of Energy. Hopefully they will get involved again, as they have in the past, in supporting large regional transmission planning efforts. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Peter. Thanks again for allowing me to spout off a little bit on this space.
Hardly spouting. I must thank you for the shout out on the book. I must observe that in 100 years, we have gone from power plants in our basement to power walls in our basement.
There we go.
So we've got a lot of Q&A, and our panelists are so on top of it that they're answering them live. But for those of you not watching the chat, I'd like, if we don't get too many more, I'd like to go to live answers to Q&A. And by the way, Rob, as discussant, I want to invite you to chime in on answers to these questions if you feel like you would like to comment on them. There's one that I don't think has been answered yet. Rob Sargent, bravo for this effort to quantify the value of transmission in making delivery of renewables more efficient and effective. Did you look at the implications, outcomes with solar, both utility scale and distributed, factored in? And by the way, shout out to Rob. You got one of the study authors want to talk about that?
Sure. This is Hannes Pfeifenberger. We have not yet studied solar. We do have some correlation data of solar output, and it's sort of in the same range that we have for the two wind profiles, but this was mostly a conceptual case study, and it utilized wind forecasts and actual wind profiles for two distinct market areas that we had. So obviously, if you want to apply this study to a real power system, you would want to include solar, you would want to include new level of battery investments, and you really want to quantify the other benefits that we know how to quantify that were listed on the takeaway slide. And in most economic transmission studies out there, that list of benefit is not all quantified. And if you don't quantify all the benefits are understated, cost-effective transmission investment doesn't take place, and we are yielding a higher cost outcome. And I think the importance of putting it all together, including solar, and using this kind of modeling approach is just going to increase as more renewables added to the system.
Thanks, Hannes. Anything else to add on this?
Yeah, this is Kai. I might just add on to that, like as Hannes was saying, yeah, to applying this to real world systems, we can kind of get a first, we can kind of think through sort of like what might be the ramifications of those other resource types or different mixes of resource types just simply by considering the correlation between the different regions we're considering in our realistic system. So what we're showing here is that, having lower correlations between resource outputs in two regions generally leads to pretty significant benefits from interconnecting them. So if that holds true for other mixes of resources in those systems, then we would expect to see some amount of a similar outcome, whether those are wind or solar or some mix thereof.
Thank you. Thanks, Kai. If we could recap some of the questions that came in and were answered so that everyone listening can hear about them. Kristen Kelleher asked, did the study explore the benefits of an ocean grid? And I assume, Kristen, you meant kind of an offshore wind grid as opposed to a transoceanic grid, which is actually also, believe it or not, being discussed. But any folks want to comment on that from the panel?
I think the answer is no, we have not. As I said, this is a demonstration of a conceptual modeling tool. I mean, it's a real world modeling tool that was applied to a case study to just document if you have two regions and everything is exactly identical, but for the uncertainty, are there any benefits of interconnecting the regions and how big are these benefits? So we have not looked at an ocean grid. We have not evaluated any specific region, any specific RTO or any specific sort of decarbonization plan.
Well, hang on, Hannes. Wouldn't it be, from what I know, one of the unique features of offshore wind is that it has a production pattern that's different than onshore wind. So to the extent that you are finding out that different regions with different wind generation patterns benefit from transmission interconnection, isn't there kind of an indirect positive implication for offshore wind in this work?
Yes, there is. I guess I answered this study, the question too literally, whether we did model or evaluate an offshore grid. But it's absolutely right. The study shows that interconnecting a diverse set of renewables is really valuable. It's more valuable than standard modeling tools used in industry today can capture. And to the extent that offshore wind is diverse from onshore wind or solar, it will certainly apply to a grid that interconnects an offshore wind regime with an onshore wind regime, solar, hydro, anything like that. Diversification is valuable through the transmission grid, and it's particularly valuable if you consider the uncertainty that exists in the renewable generation profiles.
Thank you.
And Peter, let me follow up on your example.
Right.
Actually, the two profiles from Texas that we simulated, one of them is from the coastal region. So even though it is not offshore, it is onshore. It follows, more or less the pattern that one would expect from offshore. So, in a very loose way, the study did evaluate the benefit of combining the two.
Fantastic. So, excellent.
Maybe to add one thing to that too. I mean, I really like this question because it kind of turns things on their head in a way. If you think about it, what we're saying is that if we say in this study that if you interconnect regions with diverse renewables, that there's a lot of value. But what we could also say is that if you add diversity to the renewables in one region relative to another region, it increases the value of existing transmission.
Right. Thank you.
And I think that's sort of what we're talking about with offshore wind, say off the coast of Massachusetts, which might be, transferring during certain periods, so like across the border to New York or to Ontario.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Next question is a two-parter. First of all, was there any use of superconductivity wires assumed, or what was assumed about the technology of interconnection? Part A, and part B is, would the inclusion of microgrids in your thinking really change any of the outcomes? Both from Jackson Robinson. So who wants to take that one on?
Well, I can get started again. I think we are just assuming conventional transmission technologies, but our analysis really was technology agnostic, but the kind of interconnection levels, 1200 megawatts or so, can easily be achieved with conventional transmission technology. So no superconductivity would be needed for that. As to microgrids, recall the benefit of renewable diversity is really sizable as you get to distances that are beyond typical weather patterns. So we're talking, in our case, 300 miles, maybe more than that. So each of the regions might contain a number of microgrids, but the benefit of diversifying broad geographically would still be there with or without microgrids, simply because if you have a microgrid that has a lot of solar, if if the town is in a snowstorm for 3 days, that doesn't really help you very much. And that kind of regional diversification still benefits you, even if you have a microgrid, assuming that a microgrid is interconnected to the rest of the grid.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Anyone else on this, Jackson's two-part question? That's pretty clear cut, I think. Okay. Here's one from Charlie Smith. MVP worked in MISO. How do we use public policy benefits to build support for transmission projects across ISO seams? Really easy question. Oh, I'm being a little bit jocular here, but it's a good question, Charlie. I know all of you have opinions on this, so who's first? How about Rob?
Great, thanks. No, good question, Charlie. It certainly needs to be done, and you may have heard of the Macrogrid Initiative, which is a project that I'm a part of with the American Council on Renewable Energy and Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. We're trying to do just that, basically explain to policymakers across regions of the benefits of interregional transmission. And I think it has to start there, which, gets back to studies like this. You have to measure those benefits. And so some of these broad regional studies are really helpful for that. And it's just going to take a coalition of the willing, I think, and some leadership from FERC and entities like the Midwest Governors Association, who I think are supportive of doing some of that. But it's certainly not easy. The industry wasn't set up to handle and regulate large interregional transfers. So we have to kind of cobble it together.
Hey, thank you, Rob. Hannes, I know you want to weigh in on this one.
Well, how could I not? The MISO MVP process was really instructive because it's only happened once in MISO, and that was in 2011, before Order 1000 mandated these kinds of planning processes. But what worked really well was, that the process was initiated by the states, and MISO has studied it for the states. It came out of a broad study process called Argos that looked at a whole set of different benefits of a regional transmission grid to integrate renewables on a regional basis. And then MVP projects were the sort of least regrets projects coming out of that regional grid study. And the reason why it worked was it quantified as many benefits as could be quantified at the time. And it planned for the entire region, not just a corner of the region where, the rest of the region thinks like, what do we have to do with, some transmission lines up in North Dakota? And I think if you apply this model to interregional, it's even more important that we look at a broad set of benefits, because the type of benefits that accrue to one region may be different than the types of benefits that accrue to the other region. And we have to look at a portfolio of projects that really has the potential to benefit both regions. It's much harder to do on a project by project basis because those benefits are much more localized. They're much more assumptions driven, they change over time. But if you have a larger portfolio of transmission projects like Rob's macrogrid, you have a better chance of having everyone benefit. And with everyone benefiting, cost allocation is easier and getting regulatory approvals is easier.
Thank you, Hannes. We have a question box has exploded, so let's see how many of these we can get to. They're very, very good questions. Peter Fairley has two questions, so I'll combine them. Is there a single state ISO RTO that you can point to that's best poised to plug in this new tool? And that's A. And B, have you done at least a back of the envelope incorporation of transmission expansion costs to estimate cost benefit ratios? Who's taking that on amongst these authors?
I can give it a shot. Every RTO can use this tool. it's not particularly suited for one or the other, as long as the ISOs are willing to quantify these benefits, along with willing to quantify the many other benefits. What's important here is this is just one benefit that we quantified here that is not typically quantified in these economic transmission benefit studies. So it also means you can't do a benefit cost analysis for transmission expansion by only looking at one benefit. You really would have to do a study, quantify the other benefits that we have listed on that takeaway slides and in Appendix A, and then do a cost benefit analysis of the combined transmission benefits against the cost of transmission expansion.
So no cost benefit analysis. Are there any plans to do any of this nature? Any cost benefit that any of you know of? Rob Gramlich?
Well, MISO in its MVP projects has done a cost benefit analysis quantifying many benefits, although not this one particular. SVP has many benefit metrics that they routinely quantify, and they found that the value of the transmission they've built exceeds the cost by a factor of 3. And New York has a public policy transmission planning process where they also quantify, a half dozen benefits, and they also found that many projects that were previously rejected based on a narrow view of benefits are highly beneficial once you quantify enough of these benefits. But none of the RTOs has yet quantified the uncertainty diversification benefit metric that we have illustrated in this working paper.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, but also since Peter Fairley asked the question, his famous story in the Atlantic of the SEAM study include a cost benefit analysis, and it was also on the order of 2.5 to 1 or something like that in terms of benefits exceeding costs. So I hope to see all of the regional transmission planners doing more and better benefit cost analysis with the set of benefits that Hannes has recommended in various papers.
And what we found in this study is by looking at the uncertainty and variability, the additional benefits can be substantial, especially as the renewables penetration continue to increase. So as Kai was discussing the study results going beyond 20%, 30%, the additional benefits the transmission provides by allowing a better handling of forecast uncertainty, day ahead forecast uncertainty can be substantial.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to apologize to the, there's a couple of questions that we won't be able to do live, but I will ask the study authors to make sure to answer them by email back to the folks who answered them, and you can see them in the chat. But unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time, and I want to take a moment to thank Laura Hurley and Robert Perry on our team who put this together and did such a nice job, and to invite you all to two upcoming BU ISC webinars like this. October 23rd, we're going to have an all-star cast of Dan Kamen, Amy Myers-Jaffe, and Robert Kaufman, 3 real luminaries in the clean energy space, well known to many of you, talking about clean energy markets in the post-COVID world. And then on November 20th, which seems like a long time from now, but isn't, a really interesting webinar on advanced manufacturing policies and their intersection with climate policies, which might be termed industrial decarbonization, and a very, very hot topic. And to RSVP for those, just jump on the BU ISC website, which is bu.edu/ISE. Thank you very much to all the panelists who participated. The slides will be posted on the BU ISE website, on the papers up on the website. Once again, thanks to all of you for taking a little time out of your day. And joining us on this very, very interesting discussion. Thanks again. Everybody have a great afternoon.